and for my protagonist's mother, I knew more about her than just kind of her role as a mother. I knew what kind of tea she liked. I knew what time she liked to get up in the morning. And I think it's important that you know all of that about your character, even if it never plays into the story, because all of this, I think, contributes to the way that your character would act or speak or respond in a certain situation. And the reader can feel it when you really know your characters through the writing. And I mean, I know I have been able to, as a reader, been like, oh, she knows this person, and that helps me know this person, and moreover, that helps me believe in this person as somebody who not just could exist but does exist in real life, because that's what every fictional novel is asking from you. It's asking you to believe in something that you know isn't true, which is a big ask again. So
all right, so let me begin with a quick introduction of Zuni. So Zuni is a 19-year-old author, and she has written 2 novels, and she has also written 2 books of poetry, and she is now a freshman at Stanford University, and she is studying creative arts. The special thing about this podcast for me is that I've been meaning to write a novel, and what really excites me about writing novels is that when you are writing a novel, you are not writing one novel, you are writing multiple novels at once, because the interpretation of that particular piece of writing is different for every reader. So that is something that really excites me. My first question to you is that what is the most exciting part for you when it comes to writing something?
For me, I think the most exciting part, I think that all the parts are exciting in kind of their own way. But I think the most immediately exciting part is probably the initial idea, and when you think you've really hit on something worth working on. Although those can be different moments sometimes. You can work on something for a while and not really see the meaning of it in your life, and then suddenly there'll be that one light bulb moment where you're like, oh my god, I think this could be incredible. And I think that for me is always a very exciting moment, when you realize, hopefully, that what you're writing is really worth it and it's really something that means something to you.
And what is it that you do not like as much as the other part?
I guess I think editing, although not all of editing, like a very specific kind of editing where you're on the last legs of the book and you're just reading it one last time, that is rough. Because first of all, you're checking for such minor things that it can be very frustrating, just like, I mean, not proofreading, of course, because most of the time there is always another editor doing that. But of course, you should be attentive to sort of grammar mistakes and stuff like that as well, which can be frustrating. But also because I find that at a certain point, you stop making the book better through your editing. And that's when it's best to stop, is when you reach a point where you're like, I think I'm now just nitpicking, and I think that now my edits are making it worse instead of better. And often when you're doing your very last edit, you're kind of teetering on the edge of that. So I think that would probably be less fun than all the other parts for me.
Okay. How many times do you think you need to edit a particular piece of writing?
It depends from person to person, from work to work. For me, again, yeah, it really depends. Like my poems, I think I put through 1 or 2 rounds of really strong edits before I kind of put it away. And sometimes poetry, I just keep the very first draft because there's something about it that I like. But when it comes to novel or longer prose, I would say several, countless rounds of editing. Especially with my novel, it was many. So I think that for longer work, it's normally more than for poetry, but that could just be me.
Awesome. Why don't we go ahead with another question, Anupriya?
Sure, yeah. So this is like a nice segue, because you spoke about how you find the entire process of writing exciting, and when you hit on the right idea, that's when it really flows. So how do you decide what to write about? Like, is it based on personal experience or observation, and what's your usual source of inspiration, if you have a usual or a consistent one?
Well, I don't really have a consistent one. I think it just oftentimes I think will come from not necessarily life experience, but just kind of your experience in life, if that makes any sense. But like the things that you notice and the things you pay attention to and the things that you care about, I think. And I think the way to decide what to write about is just, if you want to write about it, then it's probably worth it. Because as a writer, when you think about it, you're putting in so much time and effort and, a piece of yourself almost into this writing. So for you to want to write about it, it has to mean a lot to you, and it has to kind of be worth at least trying. So I would say for me, the way to know if I should is just whether I want to or not. And most of the time the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, then it's a sign to me that I should go ahead with it and at least try it.
Interesting. So how do you put a story together? Like, do you directly start writing things, or is there a whiteboard exercise that you perform where you define the overarching narrative of the story? How does that work?
Well, it's pretty again subjective, and it changes a lot. But I would say that if I have an idea, sometimes I just start, like, I'll make a voice note to myself of what I think the idea should be. If it's longer prose, or if it's poetry, then you just start. For me, poetry, I don't plan out much. I just kind of begin. With longer prose, I think if you start with an initial idea, then normally you'll start with actually writing something, whether that's the beginning of the book or whether that's a scene that you've envisioned or whatever it is. You'll normally start just sort of free writing for me. And then I kind of reach a point where I'm like, okay, now I should sort of step back and make a larger plan. And then that's kind of when the whiteboard stuff happens, and when I start like writing out novel skeletons and all of those things. So I would say at first it's a bit more kind of free form, and then when you get the sense that you need a little bit more structure, then I kind of switch to that. And yeah, but it's a pretty chaotic process, I think, and it differs a lot from person to person. So I think that, you know, trusting in the process is something everybody says, but I do think that it's pretty important, especially as a writer, to know that if you know that you're not, I mean, it can be very easy to feel lost and to feel overwhelmed. And I think that taking it step by step and trying to just follow the structure you set out for yourself is a good way to go about it.
So this creative, chaotic, non-linear process of writing, when do you decide, okay, this is the stage at which you will start pitching it or send it to an editor? And has it ever been that after you send it for editing, you still want to change a few details or characters? And how has your relationship with your editors been so far, the ones that you worked with?
Well, I really loved my editor for my novel, The House That Spoke. She was probably I think the best editor I've ever had. She really helped me. And I think that I don't think I ever send it for edits if there are still changes that I want to make, because then why would I send it to somebody else? You know, I think that both for pitching and for sending it to an editor, when I'm sending it, it's because I really think it's a solid sort of give on my part, because, you know, you're asking somebody to read your work, and if you're pitching it, you're asking them to consider publishing it. That's a big ask. So I have to sort of make it the best that I can before I send it. And I don't normally think about pitching or publishing until pretty late in the process, because I think you know, you shouldn't really start a book with, you know, just the immediate thought of publishing it. It should be something that you're doing because you want to write it, and, you know, the very real possibility that no one's ever going to read it shouldn't matter to you if it's something you really love. And I think that in pitching it, I think the whole point of pitching a novel to somebody is, or pitching anything to anybody, is to make it as easy as possible for them to say yes. You know, so you're like, this is what the idea is. This is why you haven't seen it before. This is why you should trust in it. So you need to make it so that, you know, they really think
product has to be ready before.
Yeah, that the best option is probably to say yes.
And have you ever had disagreements with your other editors, or at any stage have you felt like you don't really necessarily agree with the edits that they're proposing?
Oh yeah, all the time. But that's a part of the process. I mean, if you and editors know that as well. They don't expect you to just do everything that they're asking you to. You know, an editor I'm working with now is really lovely. He's made it very clear multiple times. She's like, you don't need to accept my edits if you don't agree with them. Because at the end of the day, it's your work, it's your voice, it's your name that's going to be on the book. So, you know, if you don't agree with something that they're doing, then you shouldn't have to do it. But at the same time, you shouldn't just, I mean, you should think about it. Like, and in the opening of The House That Spoke, there was this line that I really loved and I really wanted to have in. And my editor was just like, I just don't think it works. And this is the opening of the book. It has to be really strong. And you can't have filler lines in it. I mean, you shouldn't have filler lines anyway, but if you're going to have a filler line, it really shouldn't be at the opening of a book. So she was like, you know, you should really think about it. And we went back and forth for ages. I was like, but I love it. And eventually I was like, you know, I think the beauty of editors is that if they say something you don't agree with, it still forces you to make a case to defend yourself. And if you can't make that case, then maybe they've got a point, you know, and maybe you shouldn't. So we ended kind of taking that line out, which I recognize is the right decision, even though I loved it. And I don't even remember what the line was now. I just remember being so like attached to it.
Wow.
And so I think that it is a fine line with editors, and that's why it's important to find an editor who you think matches your voice and your style, and the kind of values that you want to, I think, put forth in your writing and whatever it is that you're writing. But I think most important, you have to find an editor who believes in the vision of the book, because that's the only way that they're going to put into it what you need from it. It's like, and I know this is a completely random comparison, but my aunt, when we were in New York, was on my 13th birthday, which is 8 billion years ago now, but she wanted to get a tattoo. And we looked for the right tattoo place, and we went to a place that was really good, like really rated really high, and had great reviews, and a very famous artist and whatever. But she got there, and after speaking to the artist for a while, she decided not to do it. And she said, she just didn't feel as excited about this as I was. She didn't feel like, what I wanted was somebody who would take the vision that I had and make it better, or, take it to the next level. And which isn't exactly the same for an editor, but that spirit is the same. You want somebody, that was something that she was putting on her body for the rest of her life. And this is a piece of writing that if you put out into the world, is going to be there forever, even more than your life, maybe, if it's good. So I think that it's important to find an editor that connects with you in that way, and who, even if they don't agree with you on everything, at least agrees with you about, your general vision for the book, and at least agrees with you that it's a book worth putting so much into.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that analogy. I think it applies to so many situations in life. Even with me, like when I'm working on my music, for me to share it with so there's a process, like after you compose and you've arranged it, you share it with a mixing and mastering engineer, and they're sort of the editors who fix the volumes, etc. And for me to choose an engineer who also makes that sort of like a similar genre or something like that is so important. Or likewise, like in any form of art, I think certain stages of how it's finished, who do you consult for feedback, for edits, and you'd only agree with someone, you'd only agree to cooperate with someone in the first place if you know they get your vision. So that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Let me move to the next question. So I've read a bunch of fiction, and what I've realized is that authors put a lot of emphasis on nailing down that location that they are choosing to write about, and they put in a lot of effort to define the culture, the politics, the stereotypes around that location, in that location. So why do you think that's so important for so many authors? And I'm sure you have done a lot of research while you were writing your novel, especially the Kashmir part. So why do you think that's important, and how do you go about it?
Well, I think for me personally, I grew up in Kashmir, so I had a kind of familiar connection to it. So I kind of went about, we'd been back to Kashmir many years until sort of the violence escalated to a point that made it unsafe. So for me, that research was kind of both personal as well as external. So for external, I watched a lot of documentaries, and I read a lot of books. And for kind of the more internal side of things, I sort of asked my family questions about how they grew up and what they remembered, and all of those things. And of course, as well, I used my own experience of being in Kashmir. I think that's important because for any story to be effective, I think it does need to have a sense of place, and a very strong one. And that doesn't necessarily have to be very important to the story, in the sense that a book that's set in California could have been about like a serial killer or something, which doesn't make it seem like California would be very important. But every author has a reason for choosing to set a place where they do. And so it shouldn't be that the same story would be exactly the same if told in New York. I think that location is a really important factor in human life. You would be living life differently right now if you were in London. So I think that's why it's so important to stories, is because it's important in life. And of course, you take that to the next level. If it's a fantasy author who's world building and it's a completely different realm or whatever planet that we're on, then it becomes even more important, because you're expecting the reader to kind of believe and fall in love with a place that they have never seen and will never see, because it doesn't exist. So it's really important then to really give the story a strong sense of place and a striking sense of place, I think. So, and like I said, every author has a reason for choosing to set a book somewhere, which is why the place then inherently becomes important. For me, The House That Spoke, the turning point for it as a novel was when I decided to set it in Kashmir. And I have a whole draft of the book actually based in London, because that's where the house that inspired it was originally. So it kind of just followed that maybe the story should be based in London. But it kind of was a very hollow story when set in London. Didn't really have much of a purpose or much momentum. And when I made the decision to set it in Kashmir, when I think it was my mom who first suggested that maybe I should set it in India, and when I kind of settled on Kashmir, it gave the story kind of a whole new life. So I think especially in my personal experience, a sense of place has been very important to the stories that I want to tell.
Great, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, another question about the writing process. How do you build your character, for example, like their traits, their ideologies, and their whole personality? And do you do it before introducing them? I mean, I'm sure there's a process that you go through while making the outline of the whole narrative. How do you make sure you fit each character into that narrative? And is it very iterative, or do you pre-decide?
Well, I think character is I wouldn't say most important, but I could say most important aspect of writing, because your characters drive everything. They drive the story, they drive the conflict, they drive your reader's interest. If I don't like, many times I've been on the verge of dropping a book just because I didn't like the protagonist. And I'm sure many other people have as well. And that doesn't just go for books. It goes for, TV shows and films and everything. I think even more so in TV shows. I've had a lot of my friends be like, oh no, this protagonist was just annoying me too much, so I couldn't watch anymore. And I think that for me personally, I start with a pretty distinct idea of character in my head before I put them on the page, because I think that's really important. But of course, I develop the character as I write, because a lot of times people enjoy discovering their characters as they discover the story, as they write. And I often try to know more about my characters always than I tell my reader, especially for my characters in The House That Spoke, which was such a long novel. I knew that, for example, I knew that one of the characters collected rocks, and this had no part in the story and never was, I don't even think it was mentioned. I think it might have been mentioned like once in terms of, oh, there were rocks in his room, but like, that's it. But me, in kind of sort of knowing the bottom of the iceberg, I knew that he did that. I knew why he did that. I knew what age he's been doing that since. I knew, and for my protagonist's mother, I knew more about her than just kind of her role as a mother. I knew what kind of tea she liked. I knew what time she liked to get up in the morning. And I think it's important that you know all of that about your character, even if it never plays into the story, because all of this, I think, contributes to the way that your character would act or speak or respond in a certain situation. And the reader can feel it when you really know your characters through the writing. And I mean, I know I have been able to, as a reader, been like, oh, she knows this person, and that helps me know this person, and moreover, that helps me believe in this person as somebody who not just could exist but does exist in real life, because that's what every fictional novel is asking from you. It's asking you to believe in something that you know isn't true, which is a big ask again. So which is why it's the writer's job to make that ask something that is not that big through the power of the writing.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I still can't fathom this whole notion of you knowing so much about the character and yet like not revealing it, and that gap between what you know and what the reader knows. It's like this sacred gap that's kept because that's like your way of controlling the whole thing. Like, I know more and I'm not going to give it out, and you're just going to feel it. I mean, I don't know if I'm getting that right, but it's like sort of like vibe building, or I don't know, because that's fascinating to me.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I guess so in a way. I mean, it's also just my way of ensuring that that the characters I write have depth. Because if everything you know about your character is there for the reader to see, then in my opinion, they're going to feel quite shallow, because you don't know them well enough. Because in the end, no matter what story you tell, even if it's the protagonist of your story and it's about their life from ages 1 to 18, there's still going to be things about them that you can't fit into that story. And there's still going to be questions about them that the reader would have at the end. And these answers may never play into your story. And you may never need to tell the reader, but you should still know them as a writer, because they help you to give your characters that depth. So for me, that simple rule of, oh, you should always know more than the reader is a good way to kind of make sure that the characters I write aren't just sort of, just one-dimensional, I guess.
Cool. So how do you build intrigue, curiosity into the story. I think that's what gets you to turn the page and read the next page. Like, do you have a sort of unanswered questions that you list down and then answer them, but don't answer them completely, and that answer in turn leads to another unanswered question? How does that process work, and do you keep track of all those unanswered, if you do, all those unanswered questions, and then keep on answering them eventually? How does that work?
Well, I don't personally make a list, although I have done that as a writing exercise in one of my classes for another book, in which I wrote down all the questions that were unanswered, because I think that's very important for every story to have unanswered questions, because that is, like you said, the thing that keeps them reading. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that that's the only thing that keeps them reading. I think it's also investment in, like we talked about, character and place. And, like by the time you're on the sort of, like, for example, particularly if it's books in a series, I mean, by the time you finish the first Harry Potter book, there really aren't that many questions that you couldn't live with not knowing the answer to. You could just stop there. But why do you keep going? It's because now you're invested. You want to know about this boy and his friends in this incredible school, and you want to keep going. And I think that that's kind of also very important. But I do think, that there should be some unanswered questions. But I also don't think that it's something you need to kind of list out. For me personally, I found that if your story has an arc and if your character has an arc, then unanswered questions will form themselves very organically, because the story simply isn't finished yet.
Cool. There were a couple of things that you had introduced in your book in the very beginning, and then you answered them all the way in the end. So like, did you think about those right in the beginning, or as you started writing, that's when you thought, okay, we'll put it in the end? How did you think about it?
Well, I mean, if they're quite clear connections between some things, and those definitely I knew before kind of writing the book. For The House That Spoke specifically, I had a lot of I knew what the history of the house was even before the beginning of the book. I have scenes that I've written out of previous guardians and their lives and their deaths, and so I knew kind of the whole history of what happened in the house. So most of the time when something connected to the beginning, that was pretty intentional. But also I will say that at times you write something and you're like, oh, that's very good, maybe I should play into that more, and you kind of expand on that. So sometimes you definitely do stumble on things kind of as you're writing, but I think for the final book, everything that you're reading and you kind of see is most of the time quite intentional.
Awesome, great. Anupriya, do you have anything?
Yeah, just sorry to keep you longer,
No,
but I remember watching it was like this short video I saw on your Instagram page, I think a year ago, where you were on stage and you spoke of yourself and you started with saying daughter of Zuni Chopra, daughter of, like, it was like sort of I think you're being sarcastic in a sense, or you were just you're kind of talking about your privilege in some way and how you wanted to build your own identity. So my question was about two things. One, how do you ever have friends, peers, media, or just people around you ever trying to attribute your success to your privilege? And how do you deal with the privilege of having parents who've done extremely well for themselves in the writing world, in the movie world? And secondly, how did you decide your path being non-fiction, fiction writing versus, say, non-fiction or screenplay writing or reviews? Like, how do you know this is where I'm going to make my career versus not the other areas of creativity?
Well, I think that's a great question. That's honestly probably the most intelligent question I've been asked in relation to who my parents are. So kudos to you for that. Although the bar is quite low, I must say, but still kudos. I would say that of course, I've had so many people say that, that my success is only a result of my privilege, and that, that it's all just, of course, people have said, media, definitely, people on the internet, even people who I thought were friends who may not have turned out to be, definitely, really kind of hammered in the idea that it's only because of my parents that I am where I am. And I think that it's kind of a fine line, because on the one hand, I don't believe that what they're saying is true. And I do believe that much of it is born from more an area of kind of spite than it is from true criticism. So I think that it's important for me as somebody who is kind of, who is self-confident and who feels that I've really strived, to know that I shouldn't listen to all of it. But on the other hand of that is that I do need to acknowledge that I have had an enormous amount of privilege, and that I have done nothing to deserve. That was simply a luck of the draw at birth. I don't know if you guys saw the Pixar movie Soul, but it was just chance where I landed on the earth. Nobody, I did nothing to earn that. And I think it's really important that I acknowledge that I say that, of course people say that, oh, you're very brave to do something that, not that many people do. That's true. But my parents do it. And my parents were able to give me, the support, the financial stability, the connections. Like I mentioned, my uncle who recommends editors to me, that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't born into the family that I was born into. So I think it's really important not to completely say that, oh, these people are just spiteful, because that's not true either. I have had an enormous amount of privilege, and that is something that needs to be said at the start of everything. Because I think it would just be unfair to, everybody if I didn't say that, if I said, no, it's all because of me, because that's not true either. But I think the way that I personally look at it is that a lot of times the privilege that I was given at birth has gotten me to a door, has led me to an opportunity. But I believe, and I know everybody else may not believe, but I can't spend time convincing them, I believe that the door wouldn't have opened for me if I wasn't worthy of walking through it. And I have worked very hard to achieve many things and to get where I am. So I have to, take pride in my own hard work as well. But like I said, it's a fine line.
Yeah, no, that's a very mature way of looking at it, especially when you said like, okay, there's people who are saying it out of spite to bring you down, and then there's a side to it which you believe like, oh, it's something you need to own, it's something you need to accept. And the door part, like, yeah, like you have these doors, but then to actually walk through to them, you have to be someone who's committed, who has a work ethic, who has ideas, who has a vision. So that's a really nice way to put it. I think we all have some form of privilege or the other relative to someone next to us, and it's just important to acknowledge it, but also not like attribute our whole success or all our failures to it, and vice versa. So yeah, thank you for answering that. And also, yeah, how did you decide on this form of creativity versus the others? Is it just a matter of flow? Like when your dad, for example, if he's feeling creative, he's going to be more visual, and the characters are going to actually move on stage. There'll be dialogues, versus for your mom, it's like, criticism, feedback, critique, whatever. So how did that happen for you?
Well, I think for me, that was always a kind of very natural path that I seem to follow. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I loved stories, I loved making them up, I loved telling them, and I loved books. So I think that was kind of very natural. That's another reason why what a lot of people ask is, do you feel pressure because of your parents' success? And one of the reasons that I don't is because this was such a natural path that I took, and nobody pressured me into it, and nobody, I never felt any kind of that this is something I have to do, or this is something I'm doing, like my parents did. It was never like that. It was something I so naturally veered towards at an age when I was far too young to understand legacies. So I think that that's one of the reasons why I haven't felt much pressure. But on the other hand, I will say that I haven't really gotten a chance to explore film very much, and I hope to do that at university, to explore it a bit more and to explore kind of film studies. And I do kind of dabble in journalism as well. I guess I do write for HT Branch, and I really do enjoy that. And I mean, everyone enjoys being a film critic. You can just be nasty about a film, but I think it requires a bit more education than that, as my mother proves. But I never kind of really veered to nonfiction as much as I veered towards fiction. So I think it's a really natural kind of path that I've taken as kind of the person that I am and the artist that I would like to be. But it could change in the future. Who knows?
Sure. I guess like choosing your ideal like medium of expression is a very organic thing. Like for someone it's writing, it's music or painting, and it just
and it comes very naturally, and it's just something that you kind of I think you're pulled towards, from
like you just start doing it. You don't label it. You don't think
exactly. That's just what you feel like doing, And I think it's really important for people to trust that, but also to know that can change, and that can evolve, and that's okay as well. But yeah, like I think the creative expression can come in many different forms, and you shouldn't really force yourself into just one thing. especially if you are somebody who wants to be a writer, who wants to be, a painter, who wants to be any kind of artist. I think it's important that you explore all forms of expression because they all are tied into each other in one way or another.
Exactly. And sorry, like just one question leads me to another, but how there's always this relationship that people associate of like artists and neuroticism and just having a lot of mental health struggles more so than other people. Because I think the amount of imagination that it takes to write a book or to like paint a beautiful picture or just being an artist basically requires you to have like a extra amount of dopamine in your brain, right? Like it's just like that's how it is. So do you ever feel like you too have experienced artist burnout or the whole, or first of all, do you think there's like a clear relationship between neuroticism and being an artist, and how have you dealt with that, if at all?
Well, I don't think it would be sort of clear cut that if this is true, then this must be true. Like if X is true, then Y must be true. I guess there could be sort of, perhaps, I mean, it's not really something I've given a lot of thought to, but I definitely think that artists do struggle with mental health, but I also think that everybody does. It's just artists as people who interact with themselves so often and have to give their spirit to every piece of work that they have. And, creative expression is something that really forces you to kind of get in touch with yourself and to face those issues head on and not to sort of bury them away as many do. But I also think it's kind of like a PE teacher who I will not name once said something similar to me, where he was like, if you want to be a writer, then you're going to have to take drugs or drink or something in the future, because that's how else will you get ideas, and you're going to sort of, every writer goes crazy eventually. And I was like, right, so if you're an athlete, you must take steroids, right? Because I mean, if you're not doing that, then what's the point of you even being an athlete? And he was like, that's not true. And I was like, well, that's my point exactly, sir.
That is so relatable. I'm a DJ. I've been DJing like for a long time now, and whenever I'm at a party, not DJing, just chilling, and I'm not smoking, I'm not taking drugs, people are like, wait, you don't take drugs? I said, no, I don't. Wait, but you're a DJ. I said, I'm a musician, like I like music, and I've always felt the sense of high with music that I don't need to take drugs for. It's not a clear.
Exactly. I think the correlation is a lot like, I mean, I don't know if you guys watched the series The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, which I would highly recommend, but it's kind of like that. I mean, she really thought that she needed those pills to kind of to visualize and to be, who she was. But I think it's a very inherent talent, and a lot of artists do kind of fall into those things, but that doesn't mean that they ever needed to. And I think that's really important. And a lot of people say, for example, like Van Gogh is a really famous case of this, and a lot of people say that, it was only because of his madness that he could create those things, which is absurd in my opinion. Because I think, madness plays a role in it, but I think the difference between having enough madness to create something and harming yourself is taking control of that madness in a way, kind of accepting that as part of you. And I think that if he had gotten the help that he needed, and maybe if he had lived today and had access to mental health resources and access to everything that he needed to be well, who knows what he could have created. These people certainly don't. So I think that it's kind of a bit of a myth to say that all artists have to be sort of handicapped in one way or another. I would say it's less of a myth to say that all artists have to be mad in one way or another, because I have seen a certain kind of madness, but it's more of a kind of self-owned madness. It's like, this is who I am, and I'm proud of it, and I'm happy with it, and I live in harmony with it, rather than it causing me harm. And I think that if whatever it is you're doing to create is harming you, then it's not worth it, because nothing is worth that, not even Starry Night.
That was a very interesting take, for you to not believe that you need to harm yourself to be creative. That's very important.
Yeah, I think so, because anything that harms you will only harm the creativity and the mind that's giving you this. I think that it's definitely a balance. But I think that all artists kind of definitely struggle, like I said, with coming to terms with themselves, because that's what creative expression forces you to do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this, Zuni, and I got to learn a lot about the process of writing novels and creative writing, and it's been a great time. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time as well. They were really intelligent, well-researched questions, which is always a real pleasure to have. And I was so happy to be able to take part in this. I think it's great what you guys are doing.
Thank you so much.
I'm so honored that you've thought of me. I'm so touched that you guys are, reading my book and have been following me. I mean, that's always crazy to me whenever anybody cares about me and what I write. But so really, thank you.